So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming here. My name is Diane, and I am the president of the Chamber of Commerce here in town, and I also run the Eastern Connecticut Veterans Community Center. And there we help veterans and their families with a lot of different things. And one issue that many of our veterans have encountered is PTSD. So I love to read, and I love this author and his main character. And I was reading all of his books, and I decided finally to read the author's note in the back and realized that this wonderful man has taken such a passionate interest in veterans and PTSD and what they go through that I really felt it was necessary for him to meet our veterans and then to have a conversation about PTSD, what it's like to have served your country, and some of the issues you have when you come home from serving. And it was an exciting, and it was an emotional, and it was a really wonderful presentation with a room full of veterans this morning. But I also thought it was really interesting to find out how cool it is to be a best-selling author and how to get there, and what it takes and how you do it. And so we thought it would be a great presentation for him to come here and speak to you all today. So I will, with that introduction, say it has been really fun and interesting to know you. But this is Nick Petrie, and I'll let you tell them all about your books that you wrote and your stories. I don't want to take the wind out of your sail because you have a great story. But if you would all please welcome Nick Petrie.
Well, thanks a bunch for coming. Nice to see you all. It's a nice, I know you have many other things to do rather than be here, so I appreciate your coming. So I write a series of books. The one that just came out, The Price You Pay, is the 8th in the series. And these have been described to me as a thriller with a mystery in the middle. So this is commercial fiction, is what we call it, not literary fiction, not upmarket fiction, or there are lots of different categories for all this stuff. About a Marine Corps veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan who came home with what he calls his souvenir, the white static, which is a post-traumatic stress that takes the form of claustrophobia. So it's hard for him to be inside for long periods of time. And that has its own sort of dramatic quality to it as well. So how many writers in the room? How many veterans in the room? So you've served overseas? You served in the Army? None. All right. So we are going to be talking about writing today then. I'm assuming the rest of you are readers and writers, right? Okay. So I'm going to just read a little bit from the first chapter of this book, just so you can kind of get a sense of kind of what I do. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of this series and how this book came to be, and how I, sort of found this character and started writing about this. And then really what I want to do is have a conversation with you guys. So what do you want to know? What do you want to talk about? So think about what questions you may have, and that'll be the next piece. And don't be shy. There are no stupid questions. You may think you have a stupid question. I have been asked every question under the sun, and I'm happy to answer all of them. From what you may think be super basic, actually may not be super basic. So please, just if there's something you're curious about, I'm happy to talk about it. Peter Ash opened his eyes in the dark, listening. Some sound had pulled him from sleep. It wasn't one of the normal noises of the old house. His subconscious mind was used to the wintry clank of the radiators, the wind's rattle of the loose window pane that he hadn't gotten around to mending. This was something different. Peter often woke in the night, pillow wet with sweat, mind racing. The war returned in his dreams. He'd come to terms with it, mostly, had learned not to fight it. It helped to look over and see June Cassidy snoring softly beside him, buried under a mound of quilts, to think of the life he was making with her every day. Sometimes that was enough. Other times his chest was so tight he could barely breathe, so he'd get up and pace the unlit house, heart pounding, skin flushed and damp, fighting to pull air into his lungs. He'd feel the desert sun baking his skin. He'd see the faces from those gone-away days, good friends who had died, or men he had killed. He'd smell the stench of unburied bodies. Breath after breath, he let it all come, the cost of war. But Peter wasn't sweating now. He felt cool and alert, his senses searching the night. He glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was 4:15. Then came a soft clink, like metal on stone, someone downstairs. Slowly and carefully, not wanting to wake June, he untwined himself from her naked body. This is the part that she likes, by the way, and eased himself out of bed. He knelt beside the nightstand and slipped a Browning high-power pistol from the holster he'd mounted to the underside, then took a cylindrical suppressor from his leather sleeve beside it and threaded it onto the pistol's barrel. No reason to wake the neighbors if this got ugly. Gun in hand, he stepped into the pair of raggedy blue boxers that June had peeled off him the night before, then left the bedroom and walked barefoot across the sloping wood floor toward the stairs, the night air cold against his bare skin. As he crept down the steps, he stayed tight against the wall where the wide oak treads wouldn't squeak. His scalp tingled and his heart thumped in his chest. The Browning safety was already off. He heard the sound of running water from the back of the house. He ghosted down the long hall toward the dim electric glow of the kitchen stove. The faint rumble of a drawer closing softly. He rounded the corner with the Browning up and his finger on the trigger. A shadow stood staring into the open upper cabinets, hands on his hips. His starched white shirt glowed against his dark skin. Peter had thought he'd been utterly soundless, but Lewis is his best friend, spoke without looking at him. "Where's your big thermos at?" On the counter, the coffee maker gurgled and began to drip. A loaf of brown bread stood on a cutting board beside a jar of peanut butter and a plastic bear filled with honey. Peter lowered the Browning, felt his heartbeat slow. "I thought you were in Detroit." Left early. Lewis's voice was slippery and dark, like motor oil. "Big thermos?" Peter put the pistol on safe and set it on the counter, above the coffee maker, top shelf. The cabinets were custom and went all the way up to the 9-foot ceiling. Peter had built them himself. He and Lewis had renovated most of the old house together, adding big new windows that opened the back to the forested ravine that dropped down to the river below. Outside, the Wisconsin landscape shone white with moonlit snow. Lewis found the dented green Stanley thermos, set it in the sink, and filled it with hot water, pre-warming the cold metal. His movements were quick and clean. His sleeves rolled exactly twice. His polished black combat boots moved silently across the slate floor. "You busy today?" Peter was in the middle of a spec project on the expensive side of the river, a gut remodel. The electrician was starting the rewire at 7 a.m. The plumbing inspector was due after lunch. Before the drywall delivery, scheduled for mid-afternoon, Peter had sagging floor joists to reinforce in the dining room and a new beam to install in the basement. But whenever he'd needed Lewis in the past, calling from California or Denver or Memphis or Nebraska, Lewis had always showed up, no questions asked. So Peter just smiled. "I'm all yours. What's up?" Lewis nodded. "Take a ride with me. Should be back tonight." Peter picked up the Browning again. "Let me get some clothes on." He was waiting for Lewis to look him up and down, make some crack about Peter in his underwear, but it never came. "Dress warm," Lewis said. "Leave your phone. Bring the gun." So that's how the book starts. And I write what a friend of mine calls tough guy books. So these are capable people who are often stepping into somebody else's problems. One of the ways that veterans cope with their life after war is they often do a lot of volunteer work. They often do, the folks who show up in Texas when there's a hurricane and flooding, a lot of those guys are veterans. There are veterans groups that, after the earthquake in Haiti, showed up to help. In part because they are used to living and working in tough conditions, but also because that gives meaning to what they have, the sacrifices that they have been through and what they've given in their lives. So that's the kind of character this guy is. Now, this book in particular, so this is the 8th in the series. The first book starts with him really not a very functional person, right? He is living in his truck or living outside in a tent because his post-traumatic stress is so acute, he can't be inside for more than 15 or 20 minutes. And the course of the books, they move forward in time, and Peter evolves, and the second book he falls in love, and falling in love gives him a reason to want to evolve, to get better. And so that's, that's the arc of kind of what I'm attempting to do here. Now I wrote 3 books I couldn't get published before I wrote the first book in this series. I was a creative writing major at Michigan, go Blue. And I have a master's in fine arts from the University of Washington. But mostly what I did was not it was something I'd always wanted to be. I was the editor of my high school newspaper. I wrote an 8-part soap opera my senior year, making fun of my friends and especially my enemies. And people would stop me in the hall to say, "Oh, I really liked that thing you wrote. That was really funny." And having an audience, knowing that something that you've written, is interesting, even if it's just your parents, even if it's just your friends. For me, that was sort of a light bulb. Like, oh, this is something that's interesting and feels valuable to me. So I got out of college, and my first job was as a roofer's helper, which is not a super glamorous job. And I started my first novel at the age of 22, and it took me 5 years. And I built a life in the building trades. I became a carpenter and a cabinet maker, and I started my own, home renovation business, working on old historic homes. But all the while I was writing in the morning and writing at lunch, and because I couldn't really let go of that thing. So that first book I sent off to a bunch of agents, and I got a couple of encouraging replies, and I got a couple of really mean letters. Never write again, like that kind of thing, right? But if you want to make a living in the creative world, or even not make a living, if you just want to see your work out there, you have to develop a pretty thick skin. So I learned to use that frustration as fuel to power me forward. And so I wrote another book. I found an agent for that book, but the agent turned out to be not a reputable one. And she did get the book read by a few places, but it never went anywhere. So then I wrote another book, and I grew up reading crime fiction. I grew up on mysteries and thrillers, and I really thought, okay, fine, this will be easy. Like this is like, it's not complicated. It's not hard stuff. I'll knock that out in a year. And it took me 5 years to write that book. And I found a better agent, and she found an editor who was interested in that book. And in those days, it may still happen this way, but in those days they would, instead of offering you a book contract and then editing it, they would say, "I would like you to make these changes first," as a way to sort of audition you as a writer. Are you going to be precious? Are you going to reject their suggestions? Are you going to be timely in returning this manuscript? Are you an adult, basically? It's an audition for, are you an adult writer? And I did all of those things. But in the interim, the financial crash happened. And nobody in publishing wanted anything to do with some Yahoo from Milwaukee they'd never heard of. So that seemed like the end of everything. And I was still a contractor at that point. Actually, I wasn't a contractor, but I was still remodeling houses, my own specifically. But so I took a sledgehammer to my kitchen to get out some of that frustration. In our house, we refer to that as sledgehammer therapy. And I just decided that I was never going to get published. I was never going to be a real writer, so to speak. And but my wife has noticed that when I don't have a writing project going on, that apparently I'm kind of a pain to live with. So she said, "Would you please just start something?" And so I was working as a freelance building inspector. If you buy a house, you hire a guy like me to tell you what's wrong with it. And at a certain point, I realized that I had all of these customers who were coming back from war overseas. And because I'm a chatty guy and I'm really interested in people, I'm in this house they're buying for 3 or 4 hours, and we have a conversation. And I am always been somebody that people tell things to. Uber drivers will tell me secrets. Sitting next to somebody on an airplane. Not too long ago, I was in line at the grocery store. Somebody I've never met. We're talking about, the snow or the weather or something. And she said, "I think I'm going to get divorced." really? That's interesting, right? So this has happened to me forever, and I'm not quite sure why. I think it's because I'm interested in people. But it's a really useful quality if you want to write fiction, because you get these little windows into people's lives. And so the same thing happened when I was inspecting these houses for these men and women who'd come back from war. And some of them had visible injuries, right? They had scars, burns. Some were missing, parts of their body, and they were easy to talk to, and they were happy to explain what had happened to them, right? But there were others who were quiet and were not. Just quiet and maybe a little depressed. And we do the basement at the end, and I'm down there with this customer, and mom and dad and the spouse are, measuring for curtains or whatever upstairs. And I'm looking at the foundation, I'm looking at the furnace, and this young man's wearing an army t-shirt, or he's got a tattoo. And I would say, "So you were in the army?" And we'd have a conversation, and something would come out of that. And in the process, I really, I kind of fell in love with these young men and women who had given up so much and had no idea that was what was going to be asked of them. They had signed up out of patriotism. They had signed up to get out of their small town. They had signed up to get money for college. They had signed up to have an adventure, and nobody had explained to them that going to war changes you forever. And so those conversations, I started reading, I started watching documentaries. I just fell down this rabbit hole of this thing that I was really curious about. I had, I watched the news, I'd read about the war, but I didn't think anywhere near enough about the lives of the people coming home afterward and what that was like. And I just thought, I want to know a lot more about this. And I want to know who these people are. And so I just sort of followed that. And when my wife Margaret said, "Would you please start something?" I had all this stuff that I was thinking about. I was thinking about these customers who had come home from war. I was thinking about the crash, because part of what I did as a home inspector is an investor would buy a house, and often we would show up on the same day the sheriff's department was moving people out of their house, piling their stuff up along the curb. Right? If you get your house gets foreclosed on and you don't move out in time, the sheriff's department comes and evicts you, and then they charge you for it. And so I would go in with an investor, and there's still some, there's a stuffed toy in a closet somewhere, right? This is a poignant moment. And so I was also really pissed off because, I don't know if you guys are old enough to have real visceral memories of that crash, but we thought the world was going to end. We thought the economy was tanked, the banks would go under. It was a huge deal. And yet there were people who had made a really nice living off of it. People who made a lot of profit off of screwing up the known world, right? And so, fueled by some of that anger and by this curiosity, I wrote a story sort of encompassing all of this. And that's where that first book, The Drifter, came from. And I think it was because I wrote the thing I wanted to read. I wrote the thing that I was the most curious about, that came from some part of me, some internal piece of me, that was why that's the thing that took off. And in part because writing is hard and it takes a while to learn. Like, if you are lucky enough to be somebody whose first book gets published, that's a rare thing. Stories like mine, where you've written 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 books before your next one gets published, that is a much more commonplace story. I know a woman who wrote 11 books before her 12th got published. And she's going to have the first book is going to be a series on Amazon. She has a very well-respected career. So part of it is just persistence, right? And believe in yourself when you can. The other thing that for me is important is to writing professors talk a lot about finding your voice. And that is absolutely important. But another piece that I think is important is finding your process. Like what are you interested in? How do you work well, right? If you're a morning person, if you start at 10 o'clock at night, you are not going to be super productive. So part of it is knowing yourself and chasing the things that seem to work for you, right? So I have a friend who he's written 25 books. He's written every one longhand in pencil on yellow legal pads. And then at the end of the day, he transcribes it. I have another friend who she dictates into her Word document on her phone. As she walks, that is how she especially develops dialogue. And then she goes home and she cleans it all up. There are so many different ways to do this. And it's just about finding the things that work for you. So what do you guys what are you curious about? What are you writing, A? And I don't know if for me, there is I don't really believe in literature versus, I don't know what the lowest form of that would, porn, right? I don't know, whatever that would be. I don't really believe in those distinctions. I believe that some books are better and some books are not so good. And that you get to write about anything you want, right? If you want to write about dragons and sorcerers, go for it. There's some wonderful stuff out there. If you want to write about good guys and bad guys, you can also tell poignant, socially relevant stories. I mean, that's what I love about crime fiction, mysteries, thrillers, is if you're good at it, you can bring in all the tools of everything and tell a story that has movement to it that make people want to turn the pages, but you also get to say something, and you get to explore something. In my academic career, my first professor, when I was getting my master's, I submitted my first story. And this was all literary fiction. These were people who all wanted to be the next, Joan Didion or whoever, right? So I handed in my story, and the class discussed it, and we're on our way out, and the professor says to me, and this is a very well-respected guy, and he's actually a very lovely guy. He said, you write the kind of stuff that people will actually read. And he didn't really mean it as a compliment. So my experience of academia it's the ivory tower, right? We should all be writing the most elevated stuff we can. But for me, the lesson was to read Cormac McCarthy's book, All the Pretty Horses, which won the National Book Award. So a bunch of people think it's literature, but it's really a cowboy novel. It's about two late teens boys who leave home after the Second World War and run away from Texas to Mexico to be cowboys, and the adventures that they have and the people that they meet. And the language is incredible. The setting is so supremely evoked. The two boys are captivating. There's a love story. It's wonderful stuff, but it's a cowboy novel, right? You can write whatever the hell you want. You can write romance novels, but you can do so much within any of that, right? What is Pride and Prejudice, right? But a romance novel. Oh, thank you. It's all good. Thank you. So, what are you guys working on? How about you? You.
I haven't really started down a particular path of writing yet.
Okay.
So I have been more production publishing.
Okay.
I'm very interested in reading and writing and in that sphere. But currently writing sort of a hobby that I get to more in.
Got it.
I'm trying to get into the world of publishing.
Oh, got it. Well, I'm happy to have that conversation too. So how about you?
So I'm more on the reading end of
Mm-hmm.
the realm, but I do take on writing as a hobby. I'm part of our campus. I'm not sure if you Ribbons and Shoppers, a newsletter for women and young adults in college. So I do write a few pieces for the club that we have on campus, but I take it as a hobby. I do have questions to ask.
Sure. And how about you guys?
I'm not a writer, I'm actually an artist, but some of the stuff I do is I am interested in making comics or graphic novels, so
Mhm.
it's kind of similar. But I mostly have questions about
You should listen to my wife's podcast. My wife is an artist, and her podcast is called Authentic Obsessions. So you can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcast, kind of wherever you're a podcast listener. And she is interviewing working artists, some of whom are making a living at it, some of whom are not. She's got a couple of graphic artists that she's interviewed. And it's really all about sort of creativity and persistence, and how do you sort of keep going in the face of this challenging thing and the challenging endeavor of trying to get it out there. And I've read a whole lot about creativity. I'm super interested in sort of how that works. And what I found is that it's really sort of the same across the board. You know, if you can apply the lessons from, you know, that painters talk about or sculptors talk about, you can apply that to writing fiction. You know, one of my favorite quotes about sort of productivity is from Chuck Close, who's a super world famous painter, just passed away a couple of years ago. And his line is that, now I have to remember the line, amateurs wait for inspiration, professionals just show up and get to work. If you look that up online, there's a whole nother paragraph about really finding the work in the process of doing the work. And it's super interesting. So I really used to think that like I had to really have a plan and I really had to know where I was going. But there is a Pavlovian thing where when you sit down in front of the place that you work, if you're used to doing the work there and you show up at the same time and you're there with your, you know, whatever it is that helps you do your work, you know, that muscle gets stimulated, you know. There's a wonderful children's book author named Daniel Pinkwater. And his rule was he had to sit in his office for 2 hours. He didn't have to do any work, but he couldn't do anything else. So of course you begin, because you're bored. You begin to do some work. So I don't know. That's a super interesting topic that I'm again happy to talk a little bit more about as well. So how about you?
I'm in a similar boat but initially I also kind of like making up kind of fictional stories, but I want to find like a way to make them like compelling to make myself even want to write more about it.
Mhm.
To get like into writing.
How about you?
Mostly a visual artist, but
What the hell are you guys doing here? I mean, I appreciate it.
I've written in the past, like on my own, and I've enjoyed it. And I'm not sure how it fits into my life going forward, but it's something I'm interested in. So yeah, just
I am both an artist and a creative writer. I like having elements of fantasy in a lot of what I write, but I don't usually go like full on fantasy, like Tolkien or stuff like that. I like kind of mixing it in with everyday life because that's just what comes to me
Mhm.
most interesting.
Yeah.
And I'd say my biggest challenge as a writer is I haven't really been able to get into a flow of like writing something really long yet. Usually it's just I sit down and I start writing something and I come out with things across different days that might be set in the same universe, but they're really disjointed and not really tied together.
Most people start with stories because there's a discrete unit, you know, whether you want to write something that's 1,000 words or 2,000 words or 5,000 words. Also, if your goal is to publish, you know, stories are easier. It's a good way to start, and it's a good way to audition yourself. If what you really want to do is to write fiction, and you have, that's what happened to me. I won an award, and that was my calling card to agents, and that's what ended up landing me where I am. But yeah, starting with stories lets you play with all the elements, but there's not a lot of risk, right? You can fail very quickly. I'm a big fan of failing quickly. The problem with being a novelist, quite frankly, is it takes me a year to finish a book, basically, and I don't know if the thing is any good until the end. So it's a big investment in something. So that's what's great about stories is that, you know, you spend a couple of hours for a couple of days in a row, and you can come up with something. And if it's great, great. If it's not great, who cares? Start something else. So how about you?
I'm in the novel writing a little bit. Right now I'm doing a lot of creative nonfiction for school.
Mhm.
But I like to write a lot of science fiction and horror.
Sure.
Around that.
And poetry. There you go. So what do you guys want to know? Where you had a question?
I do. I just want to know what your work was like before you got into this contract.
I was a little bit all over the map. I wrote my first book was what I refer to as my angry young man novel, and it was literary fiction. When I was in high school, I wanted to be Ernest Hemingway. When I was in college, I wanted to be Jim Harrison, who's a Michigan writer. And then I read Cormac McCarthy, and I thought, I can be anything I want. But so my first book was literary fiction. My second book was, my brilliant idea was I was going to write, they don't call it this anymore, but they did when I was doing this, the chick lit, right? So women's fiction. I was going to write something with sort of the emotional notes of that, but I was going to write it about male relationships. And nobody seemed to think that was interesting but me. And then I thought I'd write a crime novel. Because it'd be easy, but it wasn't.
Do you think any of those topic genres would resonate with the time now? Do you think one of the things you wish
Well, maybe. One of the reasons why those didn't get published is that they weren't very good. And so I'm sort of reluctant to go back and even look at them because I don't want to know how bad they really are. But the way I approached, so I was running a business and I had a family and I was trying to write a novel. And the other piece is sort of how to get published. And so I just decided I couldn't do all of the things at once. So I was going to run a business and have a family. And then I was going to write. And then when the thing was done, I was going to say, okay, now what's the publishing piece? And I gave it, I made a list, that first book, I made a list of 30 agents. And I found the agents often in the backs of novels I admired where people thank their agents, right? So, and I learned to write a query letter. That's the letter that, you say, this is who I am and this is what my book is about. And by the way, I'm a grown-up. So, it's not, you don't use a goofy font. It's a business letter. And then I worked my way through those 30 agents. And that first book, they all said no. And I was like, well, I can continue to lean on this book, for another 10 years, or I can say this wasn't good enough and I can start something else. So that's sort of been that process for me because I couldn't both, nowadays you can go to conferences and you can meet editors and you can pitch your work. There are so many other sort of roads to that now that were not really available to me at that time because I was running a business and I had a family and so it's in part there's a discipline required that's not just the sitting down, at the keyboard or picking up your pen. It is a what do I want my life to be and what am I willing to give up to make that happen? And that can be true if you're a contractor, that can be true if you're an artist or a writer. You can't simultaneously do everything you want to do, right? And in part, my wife has much more able to do that. She is a multitasker par excellence. I am, my line with her is I can only do 3 things. Like, I'm happy to do any of the things, but I can only do 3 at a time. I can't both renovate our house and run a business and write a novel, right? The family part's non-negotiable. So, part of it is about sort of acquiring that internal sense of how badly do I want this? And how hard am I willing to work to make it happen? And again, it applies in creative life. It applies in business. It applies just in life, right? Because, life is not easy and nobody's going to hand you anything, right? You have to go chase down your own life. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts? Oh, back there. Yes, sir.
What were the greatest obstacles to you
self-doubt, fear, laziness, it is a weird thing to do, right? To write a story that comes out of your own, that you're spinning out of your own head, right? Or to paint something, or to, create a graphic novel that is just from you. And some people are born with the sort of confidence I think that requires. I was not. I still fight that every single day. Saturday, I wrote the second to last chapter of the novel I'm working on now. And I was high as a kite. I was jumping around the house. I was dancing. I felt so good. And then I had to write the epilogue. And so the next day, I wrote the epilogue. And I thought, oh man, this really sucks. The whole book. Wow, this is total shit. You have to fight that, right? And I hope it's not. It might be, but I put myself into it, right? So, and that is what all creative life is like, because there are no metrics, right? When I was remodeling kitchens, did the drywall get done today? Are the cabinets in today? Did the countertops come today? You have all of these measures of accomplishment, right? If you're a lawyer, did I win the case or did I lose the case? Did I get the contract written? Whatever it is, right? In creative life, it's your internal sense of metrics, right? Is this good? Does this meet my standards? And that's really what it comes down to is, what is my taste? And, have I met that standard? There's a great podcaster. He's kind of a piece of work. It's Andy J. Pizza. It's not his real name. And it's called The Creative Pep Talk. And he's a graphic artist, and it's very hands-on about how to deal with social media, how to, lots of topics. He's been doing it for 10 years. This is so much of what he talks about is how to find your own taste, right? We all have some level of talent, but to me, the measurement of whether you're going to succeed in any given endeavor is not the level of talent. It's how hard you're willing to work and how badly do you want it. Like that, to me, that is the secret to life. Yes, sir.
There's some love. And some love.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. Yes, and quite a bit of luck. So you had another question, ma'am.
Did you ever be controversy, or did you ever see feedback?
So I was terrified because I'm not a veteran. And that first book was all about a veteran, and it was really what's the experience of a certain kind of post-traumatic stress like? Like that's a huge piece of this character. And about, 2 weeks, a month before this book was going to come out, I thought, holy shit, people might actually read this book, and am I a giant fake, right? So imposter syndrome, to the nth degree. And I had written this afterward, in which I talk about, I'm very clear, I am not a veteran, but this is where this came from. I've talked to all these people, I've read all, blah, blah, I've done all this research. But I was really concerned about how it would be received. But the reception was actually on the opposite side. So I get stuff, I got a Facebook message from somebody on Monday who's a first responder with post-traumatic stress, and how my books really helped him figure that out. I get stuff, honestly, from vets who've been suicidal, who somebody hands them that first book, and the response is, oh, I'm not going nuts. I have a disease, I have a problem, and there are steps I can take to address it. So, every once in a while I get some idiot who says, the gun isn't right, or, that car model, the dashboard light is green, not red, or whatever. And I want to be as correct as possible with all those things, but To me, those details are not super relevant, right? This is fiction. To me, what's important is does the emotional part feel right? Are the characters genuine? Do you want to be friends with these people, right? Do you want to, the weird thing about writing series fiction is, and I don't know if you guys have read, series stuff, but like you develop a relationship with those characters, book after book after book. And that's the crazy thing, is now this 8th book came out, and like the stuff that shows up online, oh my God, I'm so glad Peter's back. I have, people who think of Peter as their boyfriend. It's a very interesting phenomenon. In general, I try to be very positive online because I don't want to be stupid. I'm a middle-aged white guy. It's really easy to be stupid when you're a middle-aged white guy. So I just try to be friendly, positive. Thank you very much. So I haven't, luckily, said anything terribly stupid. But the books have been disturbingly well received, right? So 3 books I couldn't get published. I wrote the book called The Drifter. It was nominated for 6 awards and won 3. And that's sort of been how it's gone since. So very positive reviews. Again, luck is part of that, because the stuff that I want to write is also the stuff that people want to read. So I have friends who are very talented, and the stories they want to tell, while incredibly well written, are not finding an audience for whatever reason. But I didn't on purpose choose what I was going to do because I thought it would be pleasing to others. I made the thing I wanted to make because I wanted to see it in the world, and that, to me, that is the secret to creative life. And if you stick with it, things will come. Things will come. So, any more questions? Oh, yes, sir.
How much? Really 2 questions. One, what are the components of creating a successful, believable, compelling character that you want to keep seeing? Make us when looking to see again. And second, with this believability and that is all about home construction. How much research goes into it, and too much research can get in the way of the character development sometimes. Technical about a color call when you're really
Yes. Well, I'll start with the second part of your question, which is about research. I know, you just have to find the way that works for you. I'm the sort of person that needs an internet blocker on their computer, because it's really easy for me to fall off and go down whatever rabbit hole. So I have learned to, all caps in brackets, right, insert research here. And instead of getting sidelined, then I can go back when I'm having a slow day and I can chase down some of that stuff. Or it's something I do at the end of the day when I've lost my juice, but I'm still at my desk. But I think research is really important. For me, I like books that are about something, right? And the beauty of crime fiction is that it is like the blues or jazz in a way. There's a form to it, right? And the artistry all comes what you do within that form. So that's and how do you examine the world, right? So to me, that's the value of research, and it also adds details that feel real to people. So when I was your age, I would go to the coffee shop and I would sit with my journal and I would describe the people I saw. And that was how I learned to describe faces, how I learned to describe bodies. And I would eavesdrop on people's conversations. And that's how you learn how people talk, right? And it's a little weird, but I'm a little weird. That's okay. But that is how you learn. You observe the world, right? And if you want to create something that's visually compelling, it's either coming entirely out of here or you're observing the world. How do people move? How do things look? How does light fall, right? My son actually was an art student studying photography, and the kid has such an eye. He will, just walking down the street, he'll say, "Do you see that?" And I'm like, "No." And I will look closer, and he'll just tell me what I should be seeing. And then it's like the world changes, right? So learning to see, learning to hear is a big part of becoming a creative person. Now, your other question about characters, for me, I don't know. So I am not Peter Ash, and Peter Ash is not me. But he does have some of my sensibility. He's got a little bit of my sense of humor. I'm from the Midwest. I'm a very polite person, and Peter shares that in common. My parents, when I was a kid, when I would meet, one of their friends, their line was, "Stick out your paw," right? You're supposed to stick your hand out, right? So Peter's always introducing himself, right? And that's part of his. It's just a characteristic, but the difference between a complex character is just several simple characters put together, right? A simple character is one-dimensional, so you just have to add other levels of things that they're interested in, ways that they feel, and characters that are all one thing are totally uninteresting, right? So you wanna have people be a little bit in conflict with themselves. You want to have them. All black and all white is boring. The gray areas are where things really get interesting. So, I could never tell you how I sit down and create a character. Like I cannot parse that out in that way. But I have been reading for so long and I have been writing for so long that I just begin, and at a certain point, it's not good enough, or it becomes good enough. So the book that I just finished, I started 4 other books to find that opening. The character all had the same name, the main character, but they were different in different places in life. They were in different settings, and finally, this thing just sort of showed up. And to me, that's the other secret to creative life is paying attention when something shows up. Because not everything shouts at you. Most things whisper, and you have to pay attention. Twyla Tharp, the choreographer, has said you've got to keep a clean antenna. So if your life is all clogged up, right? If you've got music playing and a podcast going and the TV's on, you're probably not going to hear the whisper, right? If you can dial it back and find some place to be calm and still. I listen to music because my wife has a loud job and she works at home, and I have a quiet job. So I have music on and I have noise canceling headphones because that's the only way I can focus. So you don't have to be silent, but you have to find a way to access that part of you that wants to do the next bit, right? Does that make any sense? Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
I have so many questions, but I'll try and be brief. What's the difference between literary fiction and commercial fiction?
Well, in publishing, the difference between literary fiction and commercial fiction is commercial fiction makes money. Commercial fiction people read. Now there is literary fiction that does very well, but most of it doesn't pay its bills. Most literary fiction, if you're selling 50,000 copies of a literary novel, that's a successful literary novel. If commercial fiction, the print runs in a couple 100,000, and then it goes on from there. So that's part of it. But commercial fiction, so if you look at the elements of storytelling, right? There is story, there's character, and then there's sort of the language used, right? There's the prose. So literary fiction, there's a lot of emphasis on the prose and a lot of emphasis on the character, but a less emphasis on the story, right? On moving things forward, having things really happen. Think Jonathan Franzen, right? Compared to, I don't know, James Patterson, right? So I don't, again, my goal is to hit all of those elements, right? I begin with character, and I pay very close attention to language, and setting as well is sort of a semi-fourth level. To me, that's part of language, part of character. Setting done well is a character. And the story is the thing I think about last, because I'm just making it up as I go along. I don't start with an outline. In writers there are outliners on one end of the spectrum, and then on the other end we're called pantsers. We're flying by the seat of our pants and making it up as we go, and that is how I work. As I don't know the end. The book I just finished 2 weeks ago, I didn't really know how it was going to end. I had all these threads that I was trying to weave together. I really didn't know how it was going to go. So there's to me, that's part of the question. And the subject matter as well, right? So, if you think of poetry as the ultimate in literary fiction, right? These are about, intangible, faint emotional moments that people are trying to capture and bring to light, right? Literary fiction is the same. Here is this ephemeral experience that we're trying to capture, right? And good literary fiction just knocks my socks off, right? But, there is a thought that if you're writing about war, if you're telling ghost stories, if you're writing about murder, that's not literature. Except, what did Shakespeare do? Shakespeare wrote about ghosts and war and murder, right? Shakespeare was a popular writer. He's just the one who was good enough to last this long, right? Charles Dickens wrote serial novels, right? His work appeared in magazines in I don't know quite how long those, chapter by chapter, week by week. He hadn't written the end. The first ones were being published, and he was trying to stay ahead, right? So that's commercial fiction, except it's Charles Dickens, right? Who we think of as one of our great writers. So I'm not fond of those distinctions, and a university is probably not the place to complain about those distinctions, because that's part of your job as professors, is to find the best of the best. But in my world, my goal is to tell a fun, fast story that moves you emotionally, that makes you think. That's the research piece, and makes you feel. And if I can do that, and it's a book that someone might want to read more than once, then I feel pretty good about my job. Does that answer your question? Did you have another question?
As a storyteller, I translated a lot of, I recorded stories from my country, and they're oral tales, and then I translated them into English, sometimes French. So when I hear my friend, well, the other day I was with my friend Dan. And he said,
Hi, Dan. Nice to meet you.
and he said, I don't know, when I want to write, I don't even know how it's going to end. But I just hope that I'm not doing a good job of
Yeah, desperation is a big part of the process, isn't it?
But that's it differently. For example, when I've just finished a novel now, I mean, if you have a finished manuscript. But before I finished it, I knew exactly how it would end. And I think it was different from So I wonder whether this has to do with my background as a recorder, chronicle of tales,
Right.
as a translator of oral tales, because when you take before I would sit down and translate, I had to listen to the tale. So I knew exactly.
Yeah, you know the whole story before you begin, right? Right.
I wonder if that is what is really impacting my work as a fiction.
Well, there are so many different ways to do this work, right? And when writers get together, we all want to know how everybody else does it. And the subtext to that is, are you as crazy as I am? That's really what it's about. But so I have friends who, they build a 40-page outline. That's an incredible amount of detail for a 300-page novel. And they build this outline, and then a part of it starts to turn into dialogue. A part of it starts to turn into description, and the whole thing sort of bubbles up from the bottom, right? I've got friends who they put Post-it notes on the wall, and they build the whole book out of Post-it notes. They know the whole story, beginning, middle, and end, and then they begin. That is a perfectly legitimate way to work, is to know the story you're telling. It's a more efficient way to work, for damn sure. But I've tried it; it doesn't work for me. For me, that's the death of my interest, is knowing how it's going to turn out. I am telling myself the story at the same time I'm writing it. Right? It's like laying the tracks ahead of the train. So does that make sense?
You described what the crime novel form is. You know, as you're moving forward and laying the tracks, you also you're, you know, to be weaving all these threads you mentioned. Like demanding form, but I can't quantify exactly what the form is. So what is it that you're dancing with?
Well, it's not so much form for me as it's tropes, right? So, the private eye novel, right? We've all seen those movies. We've all read that is something that has been investigated so thoroughly that there are all of these sort of themes and ideas that float around it, and it's everything from the dame walked into my office and the light came through like you can see the black and white movie. The tarnished hero. There are all of these sort of kinds of stories. It has been said that there are only two kinds of stories. A stranger came to town, and I went on a journey. Right. So and there are that you can explode that into 7 kinds of stories or 13 kinds of stories, depending on who you talk to. People who work in Hollywood are really versed in story types. Oh, it's a fish out of water story where it's, and I'm not interested in starting with a category because I'm not that smart, right? For me, I'm starting with a scene, I'm starting with a situation, but I'm so steeped in this stuff that I don't, if I start to think about it too much, like the tracks stop. Like I can't, I just fall off the tracks. So for me, I have to sort of, I'm just sort of feeling my way forward. And I know, again, writing series fiction, every book gets harder because these characters are established and I know things about them and I can't kill them, right? I mean, I can kill all these ancillary characters, but I can't kill my 3 main people. So that's a limitation if you're writing crime fiction. So I don't know, that's more how I think about it, if that makes sense. So anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Shifting gears a little bit, in terms of career education and writing, do you feel that the MFA was worth it? Did it make you a better writer?
I don't know that it made me a better writer. What it did was it bought me 2 years to work, and in an environment in which words and stories were the most important thing in the world to everybody that I was there with and everybody who was teaching me. So, like, to me, that was really valuable. There are other ways to find that. A writer's group is absolutely crucial, is to find people who who can read your stuff and give you comments and who you can trust to not be mean and to tell you what's good and tell you what's bad. And in a way, that's what an MFA is. It's just on a higher level. It was pretty cheap. So this was 20 plus years ago. So 2 years cost me 15 grand. An MFA program now, I would not do it and pay for it myself. To me, it's if you apply to, if they don't offer you a teaching assistantship and free tuition, don't do it. But it allows you, the reason I did it is I thought, well, I might want to teach at the college level someday, and you need a master's for that. And I was never going to get a PhD. One of my undergraduate degrees is in American culture, and for a while I thought I would, I was really interested in ethnology and telling those kinds of stories, and I thought maybe I'd get a PhD. But as I went along, it got too arcane. It was we're going to do a Marxist reading of blah blah, and then we're going to do a feminist reading of a Marxist reading of and it's just like at a certain point, it's just the snake is eating its own tail, and I just wanted to tell stories. But I wouldn't. I would live a little bit if you can first, because those first few years out of college you learn a lot. Well, there you go. See, so you've lived a little, yeah. But I wouldn't pay for it. I would apply every place you thought you could get in, and I would wait to see who offered you some money. Yeah, especially if you're 35, because you have more to lose. It's easier when you're 20. So, yeah. Yes, sir.
You can do a plot-driven story and a character-driven story?
A plot-driven story, things happen, and the people are along for the ride. And often those are sort of stock characters. So it's a, I mean, the way I think about it is it's a handsome man with a chiseled jaw and he's trying to do the right thing, and his girlfriend has auburn hair and she's good curves and, like it's really stereotypical stuff. But within that, you can tell a propulsive story, an exciting story, and you can find a way to have sympathy for those characters. So to me, that's plot driven. I want to tell a story about, somebody, threatening to blow up a nuclear device in Times Square, right? I can think of 4 of those books right now. And then you build the book around that, right? And what are the ups and the downs, and how does it, what's the progress, what are the setbacks, all that stuff. A character-driven novel is you start with who is the person and what are their needs? What do they want? Are they someone who are they self-destructive and they can't find a way to live with themselves normally? So what kind of story is that? Does something terrible happen to them and they have to respond to that? So that particular character, how do they respond? Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I would like to know a little bit more about when you're getting your first book, actually, that experience of you tried to get a few different books out there, and you finally started to make progress getting this fourth book, your first book, was published, and just we talk about there's so many tropes, and it's such a full genre. I've seen your most character compared to Jack Reacher, or how do you? So I guess how did you set apart what you were making in a way that finally?
Well, it's the same philosophy that has sort of gotten me through my other life running businesses, right? So if you're a remodeling contractor, most remodeling contractors aren't very good at what they do, and if they are, they don't show up on time, or they don't show up to finish the job, right? So it's a area with low barriers to entry and a lot of unprofessional people in it. So I decided when I was going to start that business that I was going to be the guy who returned every phone call. I was going to be the guy who was early to every appointment. And often they would call 5 people, and I'm the guy who returned the phone call, so I got the job. So, to enter a field and to just do it better, to just be better than the average bear, gives you an advantage. So my next job was as a building inspector, and a lot of building inspectors didn't really want to talk to their customers. It's really an educator job, right? How does your house work and what's wrong with it and what's right about it? And a lot of home inspectors, they want to be in and out quickly, and they wanted to, get their check and to move on and do the next thing. I wanted to be an educator. I wanted to help people. It's a consumer protection job. And so how do I, explaining to people, and sometimes people had to, have things explained 15 times, right? Okay, I'm here. Like if I can't, I need to find a way to communicate that to you, right? So to do the job better than average. And honestly, that is all I'm going for when I write a book. I have a note card up on my wall. It says, just write a bad book. Because that's what I need to get started. Because if I think I want to write a great book, I'll never begin, right? How do you begin something that's going to be great? So, but to differentiate myself in that market, and again, part of it is sort of the quality of the prose itself, right? Are these elegant sentences, right? And editors care about that stuff. They don't always care about it. They don't care about it all the time. But that's a way that I got set apart. The head of Penguin Random House read my book over Christmas before it was published, and she said, holy crap, this guy is really good. We need to add on to his book tour. So part of it is just to be better at what you do. And the other is I don't really pay attention to the marketplace, right? I don't really, I've read Lee Child and I enjoyed his books. I've been compared, my work has been compared to his a lot. And it's super flattering because I think he's super talented and that series has a huge audience. But I don't think we're doing the same thing. That character is a Superman. I mean, he doesn't feel pain. He doesn't want to stay in one place. Peter would like nothing better than to have a home and a life. And my character Peter is full of failure. He's full of failings. He is so, he's all messed up. He's not a Superman. He is really, very human. So the thing that I think where that comparison comes from is that you can hear both characters think on the page. I think that's part of the comparison. The other part is an easy one for publishing to make, which is that Jack Reacher moves from place to place. Every book he's somewhere different. My character does the same thing, but because I'm afraid of getting bored. I'm not interested in the peripatetic part. I'm interested in what that character wants. And what he wants is a home. So again, he's not like Jack Reacher. He just can't quite find one. So I am not strategic in that way is really the short answer to your question. And I have friends who search the marketplace. There's a niche for this thing, and boy, that's going to be the thing. It's never really been the thing. And it's not because they're not trying hard or not because they're not doing a good job. I just don't think of that as the way to find something. And the problem with publishing has gotten more and more like television and film, where it's a lot about if you don't, the people in charge of making decisions are the money people. They're not really the creative people, right? So editors would take up and champion. I mean, in the old days, right? Ernest Hemingway, his editor, Max Perkins, gave him a lot of time to develop into what he became. Max Perkins saw something in that first collection of stories. And what if you wrote something else? Oh, and so those days are long gone, right? If you do not, if something doesn't hit out of the gate, see you later. But editors still today would love to nurture writers to say, wow, you have something special, and I want to bring that out of you. But it's, the publishing is the big publishers are all conglomerates, right? My publisher, Penguin Random House, is owned by a German conglomerate, and it's all about how many books did you sell and how it's a very different model than it used to be, and so if you want to work in publishing, you have to sort of accommodate yourself to that to a certain extent. There also is in Colorado, I don't know the name of this, but there's a summer-long publishing program, which is what everybody I know in publishing did, and that's how they got their job in publishing. So I'm sure you can find it online. But if that's what you want as a job in publishing, you also might start as a publicist and work your way into an editorial position. And again, this is often how it's done. Sort of a short version of that. Yes, ma'am.
So my question is more about the profession and start to finish. You write a book. You said you looked through other books. You had to find an agent. Did you have to pay for the agent? Did you have to contract with the agent? And the agent sent your books to do what? And how did they get to a publisher? And when did they decide? What was the criteria? What did they tell you had to do? What was kind of like in your contract? You have to write so many books, so many words, so many minutes, or whatever. And then what is a book tour? What exactly does that entail? And how much control over all of this do you have?
That's a very large question. You should never pay an agent. If an agent asks you for money, you say, have a very nice day. An agent makes money when they sell your book to a publishing house. So you want to find an agent who represents authors whose work you like, because that means they might like your work. You want to find and actually being an agent is another great path into publishing as well. And it's an agent's job to have relationships with editors, right? So in a perfect world, your agent is a New York agent, because that is the heart of the publishing world. And they can go have lunch with people, right? And they can stop into the office and develop those relationships. And so my agent knew that an assistant had just become a full-time editor and was looking for quality stuff. So Sarah was one of the people who she sent the book to, but she sent it out to 20 different people. So her job is to sort of assess, who's looking for new authors, who likes this kind of thing, what's the right publishing house for this kind of thing, so they know the marketplace. And then it's the editor's job to make the book into the best book it can be, not the book that they think it should be, but the book that they think you think it should be, right? Editors, if an editor is telling you your work is all wrong, I don't think that's a great editor. For me, an editor should be trying to figure out what it is you are trying to do and to help you do it better. And I've been very lucky. I'm now on my 5th editor, which is not so great. But every single one of them has been that kind of editor. So what is this book? How can we make it more like itself, right? How can we make it better than itself? And then, so publishing has, there are marketing people, and so marketing has actually become a very technical exercise in publishing. There's all of these online advertising, and metrics, and it's become incredibly, tech-driven, which is super interesting and also beyond me. There are publicity people who are the ones who set up a book tour, right? So they reach out to, gee, would the New York Times like to review this book? They do that across the board, and they know the bookstores and the booksellers who might like this, so they send out advance copies to see, to generate some interest, arrange a book tour. So if you're lucky, I'm lucky in that my publisher actually pays for my book tour. They pay for my hotel, they pay for my flight. I just got an email today saying, please submit your expenses so we can pay you back for your meals. Like, that's great. I have friends who are very talented writers who still have to arrange their own book tour and pay for it. So, again, there's a lot less money in publishing than there used to be. It is not, it's not for the faint of heart. It's also really a brutal business. Like, if you can't deliver that next manuscript, they are looking for people who can show up on time and do what they say they're going to do. There's a saying, I think this is true of lots of things, but in publishing, there are 3 things. You can be on time, right? There's a deadline you have to deliver by. You can be talented, and you can be easy to work with, and you only have to be 2. And so it's good that I am theoretically talented, and I try to be personable because I've been really bad at being on time. But they've been very patient with me. So part of it is they want to encourage me, and they have invested in me, and so they want, again, they want this thing to grow. And then, there are lots of authors who don't, and artists as well, who don't want to do the hard part of finding your audience, right? And whether that's social media or coming out to do stuff like this. But there are so many fewer outlets to get attention as an artist or as a writer. That used to be every local paper reviewed a couple books a week. Now every local paper is, Gannett. It's all USA Today. They're reviewing the same, every newspaper across the country is reviewing the same book. So it's hard to get your name out. And you have to be, for me, it's about finding the joy in that. It's about finding it's why I do this, because this energizes me, and I get to do, this is the sales part of what I do, right? I'm hoping that you guys will buy every single book this nice man has, right? You don't have to. Nobody's going to twist your arm, but that's my publisher's view of what my goal should be for an event like this. My view of an event like this is it helps me connect to people who are readers and who are writers, and we get to have a conversation. And I spend so much of my time alone in my office talking to myself that like to get to come do this and to, what are you guys interested in? Let's have that conversation. Like, it becomes the thing that fuels me through, the doubt and uncertainty that is, writing a novel. So, did that answer your question?
Yes, so is your publisher setting up your book tour, and how are you deciding where to go to these kinds of events or book signings?
So my publisher sets up basically the first week and a half because you sell the most books the first week it comes out, and their goal is to you jack up the attention in that first week. And so that's when I did 6 cities in 6 days. So that gets a little tiring. And then I did a couple local events and a library event, and I got invited to do something in Minneapolis, so I drove up to Minneapolis and back. But then people also reach out to me and say, "Hey, would you come do this thing?" And I can't say yes to all of them, but I say yes to as many as I can. And if I can drive there, especially if I can drive there and back, I don't have to spend the night. It costs me gas. Yes, sign me up. Happy to come. For something where I'm, taking multiple flights, it's nice to cover my costs. Doesn't always happen, but that to me, that's a criteria because it costs me time to do this. So I would rather it not also cost me too much money to do this, but it's also, it's part of my job. So I hired also an independent publicity person who I pay money to, who's out there, submitting my name to book festivals. So I'm going to the Columbus Book Festival this summer. I'm going to the Pittsburgh Book Festival this summer. So these are things that they submitted my name for, and they have to, the progress gets vetted, and so I'm, there are 8 or 9 more things that are pending, but I've got, I don't know, I think I've got like 35 events this year. It's a lot. But that's...
When you go to these book festivals, do you speak in front of people?
Sometimes it's like this. Sometimes I'm on a panel with other authors and we're answering, we're talking about something. There's a moderator who asks us questions, and then we get questions from the audience. It's all variations on the same thing. As my career has moved forward, I am now more likely to be the featured speaker. So I get to, stand up in front of a full room of people who are all readers and are all interested, and I get to, spout off about whatever it is I want to spout off about. One of the reasons I like places like there's the Tucson Festival of Books is something like 130,000 attendees, everything from cookbooks to children's books to literary fiction to memoir to it's across the spectrum of published work. And every room is packed. Everybody's excited. It's a great audience. And I get to go to Tucson in March, which is no bad thing either. So, and some of them are, they're all different. They're all different, but it's all, people want to know what it is that we do and how it is that we do it. So that's really what we talk about.
I personally think it's one of those, like, during career day, you never have a best-selling author come in and talk about it.
No.
None of us, I don't think you really know what it means to be, other than you write a book, what it means to be an author or a novelist and sell your work. Although I can tell you 6 cities in 6 days, what percentage went to 6 libraries or?
Mostly bookstores. I try not to do library events. I do a lot of library events, but I always want there to be a bookseller there because my publisher is happy if some books are sold. And booksellers are really important. The ecosystem of booksellers are really important to authors, especially authors who are still on their way up, because booksellers, really passionate, talented booksellers are going to say, "Hey, this guy was just here, and I loved this book," right? They put books in people's hands. And so part of my job is to go meet booksellers and to figure out what they're interested in. And I love booksellers because they're book people, right? I am a book person. And I learn so much, I get, every place I go, I get a recommendation. "Hey, have you read this? Have you read this?" And I come home from book tour and I'm, books are coming in the mail for weeks afterwards. Margaret's like, "What the hell are you doing?" But that there is an ecosystem in crime fiction for sure, about places that are, and there used to be a lot more independent bookstores, but there's a place in Scottsdale called the Poison Pen that they do crime fiction, and they have a huge audience. They have a huge online audience. So that's always one of the stops. That's kind of one of the big stops. There's a place in Houston called Murder by the Book. That's another big stop. There's a smaller store in Minneapolis that I like called Once Upon a Crime. These are places that all specialize in crime fiction. I used to live in Seattle, and I tried to get an event at Elliott Bay Books, which is this legendary bookseller, and they weren't interested in commercial fiction. They didn't want to have anybody come. And it's like, we could have sold some books if we had come, because there are people who read this stuff. They weren't that interested. But so the booksellers are also a really important part of that, and sort of creating and maintaining those relationships. And it's easy because they're like I say, they're book people. But it's a weird thing to do for a living. To do. I don't think of myself as an artist. I think of myself as a craftsman. But to invent things out of your head all day, every day, like I don't have coworkers per se. I don't go to an office. I am alone in a room, trying to figure this thing out, and it suits me. But it's a weird life. I mean, it's not for everybody. So, any other thoughts? Should we go have some dinner? All right. Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it. All right.